In the morning of October 21st, 1996, Death Valley National Park Ranger Dave Brenner was aboard a military helicopter somewhere in the skies over the southerly part of Death Valley. He was part of a routine aerial surveillance looking for clandestine drug manufacturing labs in the backcountry. At around 11 a.m., he saw something unexpected. A vehicle in the wash of Anvil Canyon, approximately 2.4 miles downstream from the Willow Spring, the head of Anvil Canyon. This was extremely odd for several reasons. First, there wasn't a real or legal road down Anvil Canyon any longer. At one time, Anvil Canyon had been the only route into Butte Valley and used by the area's miners. But with the opening of the talc mines in the Warm Spring Canyon to the north and the creation of a good, well-graded dirt road to the talc mines for heavy trucks, the Butte Valley miners pushed an extension of the Warm Spring Road westward into Butte Valley, and the Anvil Canyon route relegated into a seldom used byway. Then, in October of 1994, with the passage of the Desert Protection Act, Anvil Canyon was designated as part of an official wilderness area, thus prohibiting vehicle use on it. Not that the few locals seemed to adhere to the prohibition, as Anvil Canyon still received occasional, if illicit, use. The second piece of oddness in what Brenner was observing was that the vehicle appeared to be a standard passenger van. While Anvil Canyon could still be traveled by a competent four-wheel drive vehicle, a passenger van was totally inappropriate, and it couldn't be expected to get far in that canyon. Yet, there it was. Upon landing nearby, Brenner inspected inside the vehicle. It was green. A 1996 Plymouth Voyager van with California license plates. It was covered with considerable dust, as if it had been out there for some time. The van was clearly stuck in the wash, sunk up to its axles in sand, with two rear tires flattened and its left front tire also flat. Tracks left in the sand by the van suggested it had been driven at least 200 feet with flat rear tires. The van was locked, with no sign of the owner. Brenner noted the license plate number and reported it back to the DVNP headquarters. A quick check on the license plate with the California Highway Patrol revealed the vehicle was reported stolen by the Los Angeles Police Department on September 10, 96. The vehicle, owned by Dollar Rent-A-Car, had been rented to a group of 4 German tourists in Los Angeles on July 8, 96. The vehicle had been due back at the rental agency in Los Angeles on July 26, but had never been returned. It was the rental agency's policy to wait at least 30 days past when a vehicle was due to report it stolen. Checking the names of the renters turned up an August 14th Interpol alert on them. They were Egbert Rimkus, 34, his son, George Weber, 11, Egbert's girlfriend, Cornelia Meyer, 28, and her son, Max Meyer, 4. Further investigation showed the group left Frankfurt and arrived in the United States on Seattle July 8th, then immediately flew to Los Angeles, where they picked up the rental van. Egbert could not produce his driver's license. Cornelia was recorded as the driver. The van was due back on July 26, and the group had tickets on TWA to return to Germany on July 27th. They were not on that flight, nor was evidence of them leaving the USA. For the first week or so in the USA, the Germans based themselves in the San Clementine area of Southern California, doing normal tourist things. On July 12th, Egbert made a call to his bank in Dresden, requesting $1,500 be wired to a Bank of America branch in South Clementine. At this point, their travels become a bit vague, but the images on the recovered camera suggest they traveled the California coast of it before ending up in Las Vegas and staying at the Treasure Island Hotel. On July 21st, Egbert faxed a request from the hotel to his ex-wife and son's mother, Heike Weber, requesting additional funds be sent to him. These funds were never sent. The party checked out of the Treasure Island Hotel on July 22nd and proceeded to Death Valley. Receipt records at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center show that on July 22nd, 2 copies of the booklet, Death Valley National Monument Museum texts in the German language were sold. None were sold on July 23rd. A copy of this booklet was found in the abandoned van, which places the group at the DV Visitor Center sometime on July 22nd. Meanwhile, back at the van in Anvil Canyon, an investigation and search was beginning in earnest. On October 22nd, the day after the van's discovery, around 10 a.m., DVNP investigator Eric Inman was flown in via CHP helicopter to the site. He performed an initial search and photographed the location. Other than Dave Brunner's tracks from the previous day, no other footprints were visible. Some food wrappers were found near the van, as well as some fecal material and toilet paper. At 11 a.m., Inman returned to the CHP helicopter to Badwater Road in Death Valley, where he met with representatives of the Inyo Sheriff's Office. Following discussion, the Inyo Sheriff's personnel proceeded to the van's location via vehicle, and Inman was flown back in at around 1 p.m. With Sheriff's personnel present, Inman opened the van's doors and an examination of its contents began. While there were many items of interest, of particular note was an American flag labeled Butte Valley Stone Cabin. This cabin, also known as the Geologist Cabin, is located in Butte Valley, 4.1 miles westerly from the van's location in Anvil Canyon. This cabin is a comfortable shelter, somewhat stocked with food, with a good source of water adjacent to it, Anvil Spring. The flag had apparently been taken from the cabin and indicated the party had been to the cabin at some point. Some other items of note were found in the van: 2 unopened bottles of beer and 1 empty bottle, 1 empty and 1 3/4 full bottle of bourbon, several empty large water and juice containers, luggage and clothing, numerous exposed rolls of 35mm film and a Praktica 35mm camera, 1 new Coleman sleeping bag in its box and 1 empty Coleman sleeping bag box, a tent, a pipe with tobacco, a leather card carrier containing Swiss bank cards and a Citicorp card for Egbert, card from the Seahorse Resort in San Clementine, numerous toys, an unused compact spare tire and jack. Under the direction of the Inyo Sheriff's Office, the van was removed from Anvil Canyon on October 23rd at about 2 p.m. by Miller's toning of Lone Pine. Back at headquarters, a review of visitor logbooks routinely collected by field rangers turned up a valuable clue. The visitor logbook for the Warm Spring mine site, located on the route between Main Valley and Butte Valley, had an apparent entry by the group. Although difficult to read, on July 23rd, it states in German, "We are going over the pass," and it was signed Connie, Egbert, George, Max. The pass referred to in the logbook entry was most certainly Mango Pass, located a few miles from Anvil Canyon on the southwesterly end of Butte Valley, and the only means by which to cross the Panamint mountain range for many miles. However, it is an extremely rugged route, traversable only by the most competent four-wheel vehicle and driver. It would be impassable for a vehicle such as the Germans were driving. Further investigation showed that the party had not stayed at the Furnace Creek Ranch or Inn, the Stovepipe Wells Resort, nor had registered at the Furnace Creek Campground. Their whereabouts between being at the DVNP Visitor Center on July 22nd and signing the Warm Spring book on July 23rd were unknown at the time. On October 23rd at 10 a.m., the first searchers were in place. They include the China Lake Mountain Rescue Group, 9 trackers from the Indian Wells Valley Search and Rescue Group, and 8 mounted units from the Kern County Sheriff's Mountain Search and Rescue. On this day, members of the CLMRG found a Bud Ice beer bottle planted in the sand in Anvil Canyon, adjacent to a bush approximately 1.7 miles downstream from the van's location. The bottle matched those found in the van. It appeared a ledge had been brushed clear of rocks, and someone left a large seat print next to the bottle. The placement of the sitting spot, on the easterly side of the bush, suggested it was to shade from a late afternoon sun. This clue was to be the first and last found in the initial search. The area searched this day covered much of Anvil Canyon from the van easterly to its mouth at the Warm Spring Road. Day 2 of the search, October 24th, brought additional teams and expanded the search area. In addition to the CLMRG, India Wells, and the Kern County mounted teams already on site, SAR teams arrived from Nye County, Nevada, and Inyo County. Areas searched this day included more of Anvil Canyon, portions of Warm Spring Road and Butte Valley, Mangle Pass, the area adjacent to Warm Spring Road between the canyon mouth and West Side Road, and from the van location easterly to the head of Anvil Canyon at Willow Spring. There were also 2 helicopters involved this day, both searching and shuttling supplies and searchers. Day 3 of the search, October 25th, expanded it even further. A team from the DVNP searched the area between the mouth of Anvil Canyon and the far side of the main valley at Badwater Road. An SAR team from Victorville searched the southeasterly perimeters of Butte Valley. A BLM ranger began a search of the route on the west side of Mingo Pass between Ballarat and Barker Ranch. A team from Lake Mead NP searched from Anvil Canyon northerly over the mountains and down into Butte Valley. The Indian Wells team did an intensive search around Willow Spring at the head of Anvil Canyon. CLMRG started from the middle of Anvil Canyon, then went north, then westerly. The same 2 helicopters were still at work, shuttling supplies and searchers, as well as searching. The 4th day of the search, October 26, was the final day. The DVNP team checked areas northerly of Warm Spring Canyon, as well as mine areas a lost person may have sought shelter in. The Victorville team performed searching around Striped Butte and in Butte Valley. The Lake Mead team also checked Striped Butte, as well as walking the Warm Spring Canyon Road. The BLM ranger on the west side of Mingle Pass continued searching that area, as well as other possible routes the party may have used if traveling westerly towards Ballarat. The Indian Wells team searched the vicinity of Warm Spring Road and West Side Road when some footprints had been found. A vehicle SAR team from Apple Valley, new to the search, searched areas along West Side Road from Warm Spring Canyon Road northerly, where a party may have sought shelter. Finally, aerial reconnaissance was made when 2 helicopters in all quadrants surrounding Anvil Canyon, including the south, but was hampered by high winds. At the end of the day, with no new clues found since the beer bottle on the first day, and no hope whatsoever that the party would be found alive, the search was called off. This was truly a massive search performed by very competent search teams. The CLMRG people alone are some of the best in this part of the country. There were over 45 searchers in the field, and 2 helicopters in the air at any given time, and 8 horses on the ground. Costs for the search were approximately $80,000 in 1996 dollars. It was estimated by a DVNP spokesperson that 250 people were involved in the search at one time or the other. The areas searched were all well-reasoned and high probability of success was expected. Unfortunately, even a high probability is not a guarantee. In the years since '96, numerous additional searches were made, some by search and rescue teams, some by private groups. CLMRG in particular made a number of trips back to search additional areas and examine mine shafts. Searches by private groups tended to be more informal and less is known of them. 2 of the more prominent individuals in this area include Dick Hasselman and Emmett Harder. Both had conducted at least several searches in the area and wrote reports of their findings. Aside from these occasional searches, things remained calm and peaceful in Anvil Canyon. During his involvement with this incident, Emmett Harder had been granted access by the Inyo Sheriff's Office to view the pictures recovered from the Germans' camera. Due to his familiarity with the area, he recognized the sunset picture, looking easterly down into the main valley, as having been taken in Hanapa Canyon, located about 17 miles northerly of Warm Spring Canyon. Given the presence of the Germans at the DV Visitor Center on July 22nd and their Warm Spring logbook entry of July 23rd, This suggests the Germans made camp in the upper reaches of Honopa Canyon the night of July 22nd. A couple environmental conditions of the time of the incident are worth mentioning. Death Valley in the summer can be a formidable experience, especially backcountry travel. Even experienced desert travelers with well-equipped vehicles may give second thought to such an idea. At the time the Germans vanished in Anvil Canyon, the following temperatures were recorded near the park headquarters of Furnace Creek. July 22nd, high of 123 degrees Fahrenheit, low of 91 degrees Fahrenheit. July 23rd, high of 124 degrees Fahrenheit, low of 96 degrees Fahrenheit. However, due to the higher elevation of Anvil Canyon, the temperatures were somewhat more moderate. In dry conditions such as Death Valley, the air temperature typically drops 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 feet in altitude gain. At the van's location of approximately 3,100 feet, it would have been about 17 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than Furnace Creek. Thus, the high temperature of the van's location on July 23rd would have been about 107 degrees Fahrenheit and a low of 79 degrees Fahrenheit. I get sucked in. It never seems crazy at the beginning. I first came across the story of the missing Germans sometime in the summer of 2008. While romping around on the interwebs between piano-playing cats and oceans of porn, I saw references to the tale on a Death Valley forum. It sounded interesting, so I Googled a bit more and came across a report the CLMRG had done for their newsletter, The Talus Pile. The newsletter item laid out the basics of the case, but not much more. I was intrigued, but was quickly diverted by more piano-playing cats. Still, it remained in the back of my mind and was one of two cases that got me seriously interested in search and rescue field. After joining the Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit in February of 2009, I actively began seeking out whatever training I could find. One opportunity I came across was a 2.5-day course on man tracking in Ridgecrest at the end of September 2009. I know man tracking sounds a bit ominous, but it involves learning to follow the tracks of people rather than animals. That skill comes in handy in SAR operations. The class was being hosted by the CLMRG, and I knew a lot of their members would be in attendance. This was a great opportunity to ask more about the Germans' case. I had now been in SAR long enough to know that there are often details to incidents that don't make it into general circulations, and many times there is much more to the story. The missing Germans struck me as a case that simply had to have more to it. After making an inquiry or two, I was told, "Oh, you need to talk to Debbie Breitenstein. She's obsessed with it. She was on the original search and has all the background." In my world, obsessed is good, so this looked promising. Due to class activities, I wasn't able to connect with Debbie almost till the end of the class, which was at a barbecue held at her home. Ever suave with opening lines, I think I started with something to the effect of, "So, tell me about the missing Death Valley Germans?" Debbie at first appeared a little reluctant to get into the subject, as if she didn't want to dump an avalanche of information on me. But my obnoxious persistence and the thought that somebody else actually was interested in the topic finally got her going. Beyond getting a much more detailed rundown of the incident, I found out two major points of information. The first was that Debbie had much of the original documentation of the search in her possession. The second was that unlike many cases, there really wasn't more to it than met the eye. The basic information of the case I was already aware of was all there really was. This only added to the mystery. Debbie also mentioned the names of two private individuals who had performed some searching and written reports of their efforts, Emmett Harder and Dick Hasselman. She said she thought their reports might still be available online. Returning home, I swung into data collection mode. Ignoring my usual diversions of lolcats, I scoured the internet for even the slightest mention of the Germans, as well as the Harder and Hasselman reports. I was able to find a few bits, but the two reports I was after eluded me. Seeing Dick Hasselman being referred to as a retired professor from Virginia Tech, I was able to track down his university email and send him a query. After a bit of back and forth, he sent me a hard copy of his latest version. In terms of factual events, it displayed the accuracy typically seen in academic work, which was refreshing. And he had also spent a considerable time interviewing the relatives of the Germans back in Germany, attempting to develop a profile of a group. This, however, left me a bit uneasy. It's well known in the SAR field that relatives are notoriously poor in describing even such simple things as what a subject was wearing when last seen. To ask them to describe a subject's state of mind or intent years after an event is just asking to be led down the wrong paths. So while I found much of his work spot on, my experience caused me to weigh the data points differently, and ultimately found many of his conclusions improbable. Hasselman did bring up a couple of possible new clues I had not been aware of. First, there was a story of an individual on an ATV finding a couple of German canteens in an area described as being the midpoint of a straight line between Sugarloaf and Needle Peak. This would have been about 3.5 miles southeasterly of the van's location. As riding an ATV off-road in a national park was not something authorities smiled upon, getting details of this alleged event was difficult. The second possible clue mentioned by Hasselman was that in the 3-month period between when the Germans apparently became stuck and when the van was discovered, a ranger on patrol about 18 miles to the south found an abandoned sleeping bag in the middle of a remote dirt road. As there was a sleeping bag from the van unaccounted for, could this possibly be connected? Unfortunately, not yet aware of the Germans who were at that time missing in Anvil Canyon, DVNP disposed of the sleeping bag as trash, so it could never be examined as evidence. I found this second clue very intriguing due to a personal connection. Oddly, my wife Jerry and I had done a hiking trip in the very area the sleeping bag was found in March of '96, only 4 months before the Germans became trapped. The road where the bag was found is rugged and extremely remote, ending at a microwave relay tower at the time owned by AT&T. I knew the road and I knew the tower, and I thought it could have been a landmark a lost person might move toward. I also knew there was nothing much else to be seen in the area, as it's against the northerly edges of the China Lake Naval Weapons Center boundary, and covering a straight line distance of 18 miles at the heat of July seemed highly unlikely. Tracking down Emmett Harder's report eventually led me to visit his home in Devore, California on October 21st. We spoke for almost 4 hours about the case, the people involved, the general area of Death Valley. He also provided me with a copy of his report, Cauldron of Hellfire, as well as a copy of the DV's investigator report by Eric Inman, and several other useful documents. I asked him about the German canteens that Hasselman said were supposedly found to the south between Sugarloaf and Needle Peaks. Harder had some detail on this, as well as knowing and talking to the motorcyclist who had supposedly found them. But he didn't put too much weight on it, as the individual was unable to actually produce the canteens, and the responses were less than satisfactory in Harder's opinion. Further, Harder later found out there was a food/water cache placed in the same general area for a group of long-distance hiker survivalists traveling from Battle Mountain, Nevada to the Salton Sea. The party ended up missing their cache, and so it would have remained in place, and any canteens could be related to that. During all this, I continued to pester Debbie for more information, and despite her work commitments, she obliged, and more data kept flowing my way. Incident logs, clue lists, all sorts of wonderful stuff. In reviewing it, I was impressed with the quality and thoroughness of the previous searching done by various SAR teams. It became obvious to me that there were certain areas that, looking back in hindsight, could probably be excluded as they had been rigorously searched. Amazingly, this could be said of all Anvil Canyon, most of Butte Valley, as well as Warm Spring Canyon. In essence, every place the Germans should have gone had been thoroughly searched with no trace found. This was certainly a strange case. Yet, four people can't simply vanish into thin, if somewhat hot air. This is probably the reason so many wild ideas as to their fate appeared over the years. The vacuum of solid information was slowly filled with wild speculation. Perhaps now might be a good time to list some of the ideas out there and editorialize a little bit. Probably the most popular explanation as to what became of the Germans is that they staged the incident to disappear and start new lives. This was given some momentum by Egbert's ex-wife, saying there were custody issues with their son. Also, co-workers of Egbert stated he talked about moving to Costa Rica, which was rumored to have provided some sort of legal shelter if he brought his son along. As I said, this was a popular scenario. Even some SAR members and the DNVP staff thought it possible. But really, if you wanted to stage a disappearance, why do it in a dangerous and remote environment like Death Valley in the summertime? It could have been just as effective and much simpler to have done such a thing while in Vegas. Further, Cornelia had a thriving business back in Germany which required her attention upon her return. She was in no position to just vanish. Another idea floating around was that Egbert was intent on penetrating the China Lake NWC facility in hopes of seeing exotic technology. There were a lot of vague, long after the fact reports from relatives that he had heard of a very secret facility near Death Valley and was obsessed with finding out more. Further, he supposedly had some involvement in hybrid propulsion, whatever that means, and variants of this scenario either had the group forcibly conscripted into a black US government program, or more sinisterly, they saw something they weren't supposed to see, and they were eliminated by the US government Black World operatives. Further, my background also indicates graduate work and research in what could be best labeled exotic propulsion. So when someone starts tossing around phrases like hybrid propulsion, I'm qualified to weigh in. First, the phrase itself means nothing, but it suggests something exotic and otherworldly. But a Toyota Prius uses hybrid propulsion. Very cool, but nothing amazing. Further, investigating some of the names that Egbert was alleged to have worked with showed them to be designers of exotically styled automotive vehicles. Finally, if someone wanted to see into China Lake facility and attempt to observe what's going on, there are far better and easier locations to do so. So the idea that the Germans were in that area at all to penetrate or observe the China Lake facility is fantasy. The last of the popular alternative theories as to what befell the Germans involved their crossing paths with some sort of criminal element. Some thought it could have been aging Charles Manson followers at the somewhat nearby Barker Ranch, or merely backcountry sociopaths. I have to admit, there is a possibility of this, but fortunately a very low one. The overwhelmingly majority of people who have made the effort to get into the backcountry are wonderful folks. This concept has the Germans crossing paths with one or more unsavory individuals, being killed, and their van dumped in Anvil Canyon to hide the crime. The question one must immediately ask is why? Egbert's bank cards were left in the van and not taken. No activity was ever recorded on Cornelia's cards. The van was left locked and no other vehicle tracks were seen. Why wasn't the van taken? It would have been the most valuable thing the Germans had. And then there was the empty beer bottle found well downstream from the van's location. The searchers did spend a lot of time looking for something that could have been a grave but failed. Finally, while bad guys might not be the swiftest people in the world, why would they be hanging around the backcountry of Death Valley in summer? Of course, there were also even stranger ideas like alien abduction. When people seemingly vanish into thin air, everyone jumps to blame the aliens. It appears to be the explanation of last resort and useful in almost any situation. But without going too far out on a limb, I think we can safely eliminate the possibility in this case. Given the lack of clues in this case, after time, it became sort of a Rorschach test for searchers. People saw what they wanted to see as their minds attempted to form a conclusion. It's well known that the human mind desperately wants to connect cause and effect, and will often craft answers when there are in fact none. I had now reached the point where I possessed all the information I was likely to obtain for the case. I'd also spent many hours studying topo maps and Google Earth. I was beginning to seriously look at the area southerly of the van, primarily because it seemed to be the only area that hadn't been searched, and the terrain didn't seem impossible. Problem was, there was no apparent reason for the party to head in that direction. The found beer bottles suggested they were heading eastward toward the main valley. It was now time to head into the field and observe what things looked like for myself, and see if there was any conceivable reasons the Germans might want to have headed south. I decided on perhaps a not too bright course of action of making this a solo trip. I thought it important I see the area with fresh eyes, undistracted by company. My plan was to hike into Anvil Canyon and perhaps linger in the canyon until after dark, coming out via headlamp and camping in my truck at the trailhead. I thought this could be useful as the moon's phase and rise set times were similar to what was in effect when the Germans were there. I was interested to observe if there were any distant sky glows visible that could have enticed them into a specific direction, especially the south. A pretty stupid day hike. Let the adventure begin. On Tuesday, October 27th, I managed to get out of the house by 4:30 a.m., more asleep than awake. After the obligatory stop in beautiful Baker for gas and what passes for fine dining at a mini mart, I made it to the head of Anvil Canyon about 10 a.m. A couple things struck me about the trip in. First, I was surprised at how long it took to get from the pavement of Badwater Road into Butte Valley. It was about 1.5 fucking hours with no stopping or sightseeing. I was also impressed by how bad the road becomes at places after passing Warm Spring. These sort of observations were precisely the reason I wanted to do this first trip alone. I wanted to look at all of this as someone who had never seen it before, just as the Germans had, and note what feelings or impressions I got. And the underlying impression was that this was one very remote place, and I hadn't even left the truck yet. I started off from the truck and down Enville Canyon about 10 a.m. It was very windy and pretty cool, maybe 60 degrees. As I left the trailhead at Willow Spring, I noted there is no obvious way to know if there's really water present unless you go down and rummage through the brush. Through a casual observer, it just looks like dense brush. On the way to the van's location, another observation. I was really amazed at how much burrow tracks look like human sneaker footprints. I could see how someone not knowing what they were could mistake them for fresh human tracks and maybe follow them. It appeared as if there was a deranged running club going up and down Enville Canyon. Oh yeah, and I was struck by how sandy and loose the material was that comprised the road and the wash. Very easy to get a vehicle stuck. With the GPS coordinates, I made it to the van's location easily. There was a rock cairn present on the large rock near where the left front of the vehicle came to rest. I marked off the approximate outline of the van with flags and took photos to match those in the DVNP investigator's report. It was pretty obvious how they took a right fork when the road, such as it was, actually veered left and ended up in no man's land. As I climbed up the bank of the wash to the south to take overall pictures, it suddenly struck me that Egbert probably did the same thing and was at the same spot on the bank to get an overview of where they were. It was a very eerie feeling. I continued on to the bottle site, which I started calling the bottle bush, coming across some old bones. They looked a bit large to be human, and I guessed burrow. I took pictures and coordinates. The bones were later determined to be burrow. Finding the bottle bush was a little tricky. The coordinates I had from Debbie were rounded a bit, but close. I had printed out the two poor black and white prints I had of the location, and was able to line up the background hills for a good match. There was only about 100-foot area along the wash where the topography lined up. If I had better prints, it would have been easy to find an absolutely precise spot, but I was close enough. I did find what I thought to be the bottle bush, although the ground in front of it looked like it had been eroded by a bit of flooding in the intervening years. I sat there a while and thought about where I was, what I was seeing, and took some panoramas of the view. The seating location obviously suggests shading from a very late afternoon sun. Early in the day, it would have been in direct sun, so I think that puts a general time of day on when it was used. At this point, the wind had picked up much more, and the weather was getting colder and weirder. The main valley was dusty enough that I could not see past the mouth of Anvil Canyon in the distance, or to the other side of the main valley. There was a real milky-looking overcast that left me with an ominous feeling. Looking at the time, I was thinking I wouldn't be able to make it southerly past Squaw Spring as I would have liked, and still make it back to my truck by 5 p.m. I had already decided I didn't want to be out hiking in Anvil Canyon after dark, as there wouldn't be much of a moon with the overcast. Also, being there solo, the history of the place, and the weather was all making things more than a bit creepy for me. I decided I had time to poke a bit more down Anvil Canyon, then up to Squaw Spring. My map showed an old road that ran from Anvil Canyon southwest up to Squaw Spring. As I traveled easterly down Anvil Canyon, I was looking for anything that might have enticed the Germans to head south. For most of the route, that way was blocked by mountains, but near the bottle bush, the topography to the south opened up. I knew that Squaw Spring was up there somewhere. Having seen the burro tracks, I was assembling a marvelous scenario in my mind, where the Germans had also seen them and been led astray. My brilliant theory was that when they got to the bend in the road shown on my map, that turns back to the right and heads southwesterly up to Squaw Spring, they may have seen burro tracks heading up the road to the spring, and thinking they were human, followed them south. Of course, I knew that CLMRG had returned to that area on later search and thoroughly explored Squaw Spring area without luck, but I put that thought aside and was quite proud of my idea. Sadly, that idea was dashed when I reached the road bed. I use the term road in the loosest sense. The road up to the right was so faded it was almost invisible, and it was so rocky it couldn't have possibly shown burro tracks. Nevertheless, I started up the road, climbing up the alluvial fan towards Squaw Spring. Looking south at this point, I couldn't think of any conceivable reason they would have been drawn in that direction. While the terrain to the south looked milder, there was no obvious attraction to proceed that way. As I reached the ridge opposite Squaw Spring, an incongruous clump of green on the hillside, it was almost 3 p.m. and time to get the hell out of Dodge, so I really didn't get to poke in the shrubs at all. But as with Willow Spring, this was a case of not seeing obvious water. Now the road to Squaw Spring makes almost a 180 bend, so you end up going east down Anvil Canyon a ways, then backtrack up to Squaw Spring. To save distance and get out of this crazy place as quickly as possible, I decided to save time and just head cross country, almost straight back to the van, cutting off maybe a mile and a half, and lots of walking in sand. It was an adventure, going up and down through the ravines. I saw some interesting stuff I wouldn't have otherwise seen. I came across a nice 50 caliber shell casing from 1943, a sure sign that I'm in a way out of the way place. I found a great many of those out in the desert. By now, the wind was howling, not quite yet bad enough for goggles, and the temperature had dropped to the mid-50s. I got back to the truck at about 4:40 p.m., after covering a total of just over 12 miles for the day. As there was still light for about another hour, I decided I'd just try for home rather than spend a night with the truck rocking in the wind. Not to mention being a little relieved to return to civilization and away from this god-awful place. I managed to get home just after 10 p.m., more than a little tired. 10 hours of driving and almost 7 hours of hiking. Sadly, I have done stupider things, and would yet do worse. So having seen the spots and soaking up the ambience, I began dwelling on the problem, trying to come up with a scenario that reasonably fit what was known about the case, and as a bonus, might just make some sense. On October 29th, only 2 days after my hike, I was at home looking at an overall map of Death Valley. Like viewing one of those optical illusions where an image suddenly pops out, everything just fell into place and became visible. I suddenly saw a way the Germans could have ended up in Anvil Canyon through a series of reasonable, honest mistakes, and why they might have set out for the south. I was also acutely aware that I might have done exactly the same thing were I in their situation. Is this, in fact, what happens? No one can know for sure, but it offered an explanation for their apparent actions and fits the known facts of the incident very well. The next section is a slightly edited down version of an email I sent out to several interested parties on October 29th. I concoct a theory, the southerly scenario. I believe there are sometimes situations in which individuals can end up finding themselves in great peril without making grossly bad decisions. Fortunately, it doesn't happen often, but I think it does happen. In the case of the Germans, it involves a series of honest mistakes that I myself could have made and ended up in a similar situation. But there is one piece of information that I and many reading this would have that Egbert didn't, and that piece of information probably would have changed the outcome. There are some who will say that any backcountry travel in Death Valley using a normal street vehicle in summer is inherently foolish. This is certainly a debatable topic, but it is well known that the summer in Death Valley does have a strong attraction for many European visitors, especially Germans. And every year, many backcountry visits happen without incident. So, for purposes of this discussion, I will set aside the overall reasonableness of summer travel in Death Valley and focus on specific actions. Going into this, there are a couple of big picture parameters that should be kept in mind. The rental van was due back in Los Angeles on July 26, and they were returning to Germany the next day, the 27th. They may have been low on funds. The official reports indicate Egbert had some trouble getting money transferred to him earlier in the trip. He later requested additional money from his ex-wife, sent to him in Las Vegas. This didn't occur, so perhaps the money was an issue as they planned to travel to Yosemite via Death Valley. Arriving at the visitor center on the 22nd, they may have been looking for a route to see interesting Death Valley things, with the ultimate goal being Yosemite. But why would they head down West Road and not see major DV attractions? The Germans obviously knew that with valley floor temperatures reaching 124 degrees Fahrenheit, they couldn't camp in the main valley, and low funds would have precluded renting a room at Furnace Creek. But the hot weather camping could be tolerable if they headed up a side canyon to make camp up and away from the valley floor, where camping is not permitted. Perhaps they made inquiries about camping at the visitor center on the 22nd. Camping up a side canyon is supported by Ahmet's harder comment that he recognized in their photo develop roll a sunset view taken in Hanapa Canyon. There's also water in the upper reaches of Hanapa. Note that there aren't any camping opportunities on the east side of the valley, but several on the west. This could explain their choice of the west side road. The maps they had available to them showed a route to the west via Butte Valley and Mango Pass, past the infamous Barker Ranch, Charles Manson's old hangout, then north to the ghost town of Ballarat, and on to Yosemite. Possibly an entertaining route for the Germans if they knew the history of these locales. Their lack of familiarity with the desert road conditions was obvious in the overall plan, but understandable. They had no real appreciation for how rugged routes like these could actually be, but there was probably some reasonable wariness on their part. But at a planning level, it made sense. So at this point, we have the Germans up Hanapa Canyon on the night of July 22nd. They would have successfully navigated a considerable number of dirt road miles on West Side Road, which may have lowered their guard as to potential hazards. They also made it up Hanapa Canyon in their vehicle, no small achievement, which may have further bolstered their confidence as to backcountry traveling. And they had 3 nights left before they had to be back in Los Angeles, just enough time for a quick trip through Yosemite, which they may have expected to reach by the next night, the 23rd. So probably early on the morning of the 23rd, to beat the heat, they left Hanapa Canyon and continued south to Warm Spring Road and turned west. They would have experienced a very fine dirt road at that point, validating their overall plan. Reaching the Warm Spring camp, they probably stopped because they thought it was an active settlement of some sort, and to make inquiries as to the road conditions further west, a reasonable course of action. Instead, they found the Warm Spring camp deserted, and actually part of Death Valley. So they signed the register indicating they were going over the pass. This would have meant Mangle Pass. It also suggests a certain amount of caution and foresight, leaving a record should anything happen. Again, reasonable actions. Continuing westerly towards Butte Valley, they encountered their first section of truly questionable two-wheel drive road. These segments would have been quite challenging, but aren't too lengthy. If Egbert was skilled enough to traverse them, and had taken out the damage collision waiver on the van, he may have been put back at ease when reaching the relatively benign portions of the road inside Butte Valley. By now, they would have invested considerable time getting in there. Thus, the pressure to continue westward would have mounted. Coming upon the stone cabin, it again would have looked like someone's home. It would be reasonable for them to stop and make another attempt to inquire about road conditions, but when doing so, found it empty, the cabin part of the park system. So on they continued, securing the flag in the van. As they approached Mango Pass, it would have become apparent their vehicle was incapable of continuing. There's probably some foot scouting of the route, but it was obvious they had to turn back. Now there was a problem. At this point, it was probably late afternoon. Via Warm Spring Road, it would have taken at least 2 hours for them to return to the paved road in the valley, and it was going opposite the direction they needed to go. The clock was working against them if they wanted to see Yosemite and be back in LA on the 26th. Plus, they already knew how bad portions of the road were between Butte Valley and Warm Spring, and could not have been looking forward to traveling over those segments again. However, their pamphlet offered an erroneous alternative, apparently shorter route back down the valley in the form of a road down Anvil Canyon. Although one should always be wary of the devil you know versus the devil you don't, it may have seemed a reasonable gamble. After all, they could always turn around if it got too bad and use Warm Spring Road instead, couldn't they? So now it's late afternoon on the 23rd, and the Germans return to the intersection at Stone Cabin and turn right onto Anvil Canyon Road. This intersection is so obvious it's highly improbable they got confused and accidentally turned down Anvil Canyon. Stripe Butte is both a massive landmark and guidepost, showing the way in and out of Butte Valley. The turn onto Anvil Canyon Road was likely premeditated and reasoned, and the first 1.5 miles until the mouth of the canyon are quite fine, validating their choice and perhaps lowering their guard. And even the portions after passing into the mouth of Anvil Canyon are reasonable for a while. But then Egbert would have quickly discovered he was driving in more of a wash than a road. And if you're used to driving a rear-wheel drive vehicle, although the van was front-wheel drive, and you come upon a sandy area, what do? You keep your speed up at all costs. You drive like hell. The need to keep moving at a fast speed, plus a desire to get back to the main canyon ASAP, likely contributed to driving much too fast for conditions, especially given their low-slung vehicle. It was only a matter of time until rocks started taking out the rear tires. But given the front-wheel drive aspect of the van, they may have been slowed, but could still keep moving forward. Most people who have been in that uncomfortable situation know that if you stop, it's difficult or impossible to get started again. So whatever you do, don't stop. After over 2 miles of successful but no doubt frightening travel, the Germans misjudged a road fork and went right when the road in fact veered left, thus sealing their fate. This put them in a right side tributary of the Wash. It appears they realized this and tried to cut back left to join the main road and got stuck in the sandy, gravelly area in between. Given the nature of the Wash, use of a compact spare would not have provided them with much benefit, what with two other flat tires. At this point, they entered into a survival situation, but may not have fully appreciated that fact. The temperature, which peaked that day on the valley floor at 124 degrees, was maybe 104 at their elevation, at this late time in the day. Hot, but not necessarily lethal. Their main concern might have been suddenly realizing they needed to have their band back in LA in just a few more days to meet their flight. They clearly needed to find someone to help them extract their vehicle. The site evidence suggests someone, probably Egbert, traveled 1.7 miles easterly down Anvil Canyon and drank a beer under a bush while sitting on the ground. The size of the butt prints suggests it was a large person and thus Egbert. The location of the bottle and prints on the easterly side of the bush suggest it was providing shade during the very late afternoon. From this location, it's possible to see easterly down the canyon to the mouth of Anvil Canyon, and all the way to the east side of the main valley where the paved Badwater Road is, about 60 miles out. It is also a good spot to formulate a plan of action. The Germans were stranded in a spot in which they needed the help of others to extricate their vehicle and thus be able to make their flight back home. Given the information available to them, where could they best find it? It is likely they had gone the entire day without seeing another human, so their entry route offered little hope of others. In examining their maps, Ballarat was many miles away with unknown services. Furnace Creek, with everything they needed, was far to the north out of their reach. Even the paved Badwater Road on the valley's east side had only intermittent traffic and was in a zone of lethal heat. But there was another possibility. Remember that the Germans were new to the desert Southwest and unfamiliar with things that to some of us were so obvious we don't even realize we take them for granted. The Germans had likely seen military installations in Europe, and they had certain commonalities. They all had fences which were regularly patrolled by armed personnel. From Egbert's perspective and knowledge pool, the likelihood of patrols or sentries at the edge of a military installation would have seemed quite high. Egbert, looking at the maps available to him, would have seen the northern boundary of the China Naval Weapons Center to be only about 8 or 9 miles south of them. This was about the same distance he could see from his resting spot to the mouth of Anvil Canyon, which does not appear that distant, and only half of that to Badwater Road. Also, from the same resting spot, looking to the south shows what appears to be a simple traversable route south, up over a low pass in the mountains. It would be easy to imagine cresting the hills he was looking at to the south and seeing the safety of a military installation just a few miles further. Plus, instead of descending down into lethal heat, they would have been able to stay high at lesser temperatures. It would seem a clever and reasonable idea. Of course, we who have seen U.S. desert military installations know that there are seldom fences and few, if any, patrols. Security is provided more by vastness rather than fencing, but someone from Germany wouldn't know that. This is what we know that Egbert didn't. After formulating his plan at the bottle bush, Egbert headed back to the van. The group then probably spent the night at the van. A stay of some duration was evidenced by the presence of fecal material in dug holes, and then early the next morning locked the vehicle and headed east down Anvil Canyon to a little past the bottle bush, then turned south towards the China Lake NWC boundary in hopes of rescue. Having been at the stone cabin, they would have seen Anvil Spring and known of the presence of water and shelter only 4 miles behind them. But they chose not to avail themselves of this because they didn't feel as if they were in a survival situation, felt no time pressure due to their travel plans, and were confident enough that they would come across soldiers who could help them with their predicament. The stone cabin, while offering water and shelter, offered no immediate means of extrication for them, and they could miss their flight home. There is a rather famous saying from Sherlock Holmes: "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." In other words, at this point, given the amount of expert searching already performed, the probability of the Germans being found in Anvil Canyon, between Anvil Canyon and Warm Spring, or in the main valley, was very low. The inescapable conclusion, therefore, is that they must be somewhere that hasn't been yet searched, and that would be south. What route or routes might they have used? The topography constrains such that there are really only 3 north-south drainages easterly of Squaw Spring of varying degrees of obviousness. As one travels east down Anvil Canyon, the most pronounced route is almost opposite the bottle bush. That's not to say that they couldn't have headed south directly from the van, but the range of mountains immediately south do appear intimidating. Besides, Egbert would have already seen the apparent pass beyond Squaw Spring. About 2 miles southerly of Squaw Spring, one reaches the edge of a high valley. Actually, it appears to be more of a combination of alluvial fans. This valley is a rectangle about 1.5 miles north-south and about 2 miles east-west. On the southerly edge, there's a rim of hills before it drops down into a vast vista across the Wingate Wash area and into China Lake NWC, where there is little to be seen. This range of hills provides a first clear view of what lies ahead. Upon reaching this upper alluvial fan area and not immediately seeing the military facility, the party may have started to realize their error, that it was indeed a survival situation, and paused. Egbert may have left Connie and the kids at some shelter locale and proceeded onward in search of help, never to return. This scenario suggests reconsideration of the sleeping bag found near the AT&T relay tower and the German canteens allegedly found between Needle Peak and Sugarloaf. So, in summary, this incident could have been the result of a series of honest mistakes or minor lapses in judgment. Further, Egbert was a smart guy, and the prospect of salvation via military facility could well have occurred to him, drawing them all into a no-win situation. We knew where they were not. They must be somewhere that hasn't been searched. Up until now, there hasn't been shown any compelling reason why they would turn south. It looked like it was time to have a closer look in that direction.